began not with a sword, but with a... Beneath her jeweled collar, behind the velvet drapes of power, within the heart of a woman who had defied centuries but could not escape the final arithmetic of time, they say she ruled like a storm, brilliant, unpredictable, divine. But storms always end in stillness. The year was 1800, and for the first time in decades the court was quiet. The dances had ceased, the lutes silenced, the air in Richmond Palace heavy with something more ancient than fear, inevitability. She hadn't slept, not truly. She stood for days, refusing to lie down, as though surrendering to rest would summon death more swiftly. Each hour etched its mark deeper into her face powdered so thickly it cracked like dried parchment, a face once beloved and feared, now stretched over bone and regret. Servants watched from shadows, paralyzed not by etiquette, but by something colder, the terror of watching a god become human. Elizabeth Tudor, England's Lyonesse, the Virgin Queen, stood trapped in a wadi that once obeyed her every command, now stiffening, trembling, failing with cruel indifference. They whispered of her silence, of the way her lips moved with no sound, of eyes that stared at corners where no one stood. They say she spoke to phantoms, her mother Anne, headless and betrayed, her once rival Mary, now dust in Scotland's ground, her advisors, her lovers, her guilt, the woman who never married, who turned courtship into conquest, now had only echoes for companions. The sickness wasn't sudden. It came like mist creeping over a moor, subtle, invasive. Permanent her appetite vanished. Her mind flickered, and when her legs gave out beneath her, she fell not into the arms of a courtier, but onto cold stone, silent, heavy, and alone. The silence afterward was unbearable. No royal command, no final speech, no grand exit, just the thud of mortality interrupting one of the greatest reigns in human memory. Her ladies-in-waiting wept, not aloud but inwardly, for to cry in front of a dying monarch is to admit that gods can die. She was not embalmed immediately. No one dared touch her. For days she remained there, her body slowly succumbing to the rot she had hidden for so long beneath lace. And powder. The scent of decay, mixed with rosewater and fear. Some say the delay was political, no heir declared, no certainty in succession. Others whisper that even in death, Elizabeth would not be rushed. Her throne, gleaming and empty, became a symbol of awe and dread. Across the land, the people whispered prayers, unsure whether to mourn or fear what came next. She had ruled so long, she had become time itself. How do you mourn time? How do you bury a myth? But if her death was quiet, her life had been forged in noise, in fire, betrayal, and blood. She had not been born to reign, she had been born to survive. An unwanted daughter of a disgraced queen and a king who treated wives like chess pieces. Before she learned to walk, she was declared illegitimate. Before she learned to love, she was taught not to trust. As a child, she lived in the margins of power, always close enough to see it, never close enough to grasp it. When her mother was executed, her name became a curse at court. When her father remarried and remarried again and again, she became a symbol of the instability she would one day conquer. They imprisoned her in the Tower of London. She was only 20. No crown, no allies, just stone walls and whispered plots. She learned that silence could be louder than screams, that survival was its own kind of vengeance. When Queen Mary, her sister, began her campaign of terror, burning heretics by the hundreds, Elizabeth was forced to walk a tightrope above a pit of fire. She smiled, she obeyed, but she waited. And when the fire finally burned itself out, she did not step over the ashes with glee, she ascended. At 25, she became queen, not through victory, but vacancy. The throne had no other answer. England was divided, broke, bleeding, and then came Elizabeth with her golden hair, her unreadable eyes, her refusal to kneel before any man. They called her Gloriana, they painted her as a goddess, but the truth was grittier. She was calculating, brilliant, unforgiving. Her court was a chessboard of spies and suitors, traitors and poets. She wielded loneliness like a sword. Every proposal rejected became another line in her legend. Every child she never bore became a shield against dynastic manipulation. She chose her country over her heart again and again. But the cost was etched into her soul. She was never held the way a woman longs to be held. Her closest adviser, Lord Burghley, was more father than friend. Robert Dudley, her great love, could never be her husband. The crown would not allow it, and so she loved from behind walls and ruled from behind masks, even as her enemies closed in. Spain with its invincible armada, Rome with its papal bulls, Scotland with its pretender queens, she stood firm. These say she addressed her soldiers in armor, declaring she had the heart and stomach of a king. They believed her. How could they not? Her reign was an illusion made real by force of will, but illusions require energy, and as the years wore on, that energy waned. Her laughter grew forced, her court more distant. The brilliance remained, but the warmth drained away. She became a symbol more than a sovereign, a woman who had become myth and could not afford to be mortal. But beneath the jewels and portraits, beneath the symbols and stories, there remained a girl who had watched her mother's execution, who had been locked away by her own blood, who had risen not by destiny, but defiance. She gave England its golden age, but she gave herself nothing. And in the end, there were no heirs to weep for her, no children to carry her memory in their bones, only silence and stone and the stifling air of a palace too used to grandeur to understand grief. Her death was not a tragedy, it was a reckoning, for in the end, even the greatest monarch must meet the same end as the humblest peasant, not with fireworks, but with a whisper. Elizabeth died as she lived, on her own terms, in her own time, and always alone. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, beneath the vaulted stone arches where England's kings and queens sleep side by side. But she rests alone. No consort, no lineage, just a marble effigy carved to reflect the woman England wanted to remember, not the one who trembled in Richmond. Above her, the Latin inscription reads, "Consorts in realm and tomb." But that's a lie. There was no consort in her realm, and in her tomb only echoes. James VI of Scotland, son of her executed cousin Mary, was summoned to inherit what Elizabeth left behind. The irony was bitter. Mary, whom Elizabeth had imprisoned and eventually sanctioned to die, now had the last laugh as her blood took the English throne. The Tudor line, bold, brutal, divine in its own mythos, ended not with a rebellion, not with fire, but with a slow crumbling into stillness. Elizabeth had spent her life ensuring no man ruled beside her, and yet, in death, a man's shadow covered the throne she'd built from her own pain. James entered England as a stranger. His rule would reshape the kingdom, but the golden age had ended with Elizabeth's final breath. And so the myth of the Virgin Queen began, larger than her body, louder than her whispers, brighter than the rot she had hidden under paint and lace. But myths are dangerous things. They blind us. They comfort and deceive. They make legends out of loneliness, power out of pain. Elizabeth's myth became a golden shroud, one that history would wrap tighter around her until the woman beneath it disappeared entirely. Yet the truth still lingers, in the corners where dust clings to forgotten letters, in the pages of poems she inspired, and in the silent, unspoken dread shared by every ruler who has ever stood alone. Because the lesson she left behind was never about glory, it was about cost. She had won everything and everyone, and yet her final legacy was silence. Still, the world she ruled did not stop spinning. Beneath the cracked foundations of Elizabeth's court, new forces had begun to stir. movements that even her iron will could not restrain. The age of kings and queens, of divine right and royal command, was beginning to falter. In its place, whispers of liberty, of revolution, of voices rising from below. But back in the 16th century, power still wore a crown, and faith still tore nations in half. Elizabeth had seen it firsthand, the way religion could become a weapon, how faith and fire could dance together in execution squares. She had lived through the Marian burnings, watched as men and women were turned into human torches in the name of God. And when she took the throne, she swore there would be no more blood in the streets. And yet, blood always finds a way. Her policy of religious moderation, what some called tolerance, others called cowardice, was a daily high-wire act. Too Protestant for the Catholics, too Catholic for the Puritans, Elizabeth walked the edge with a dancer's poise and a butcher's nerves. Behind closed doors, her spy master Francis Walsingham built a web that stretched across Europe, intercepting plots, decrypting letters, and quietly ensuring that enemies died before their blades could strike. Torture chambers beneath the tower buzzed in the dark. Foreign agents vanished without trial. It was empire built on illusion, and illusion sharpened by fear. And always, she smiled. Her portraits never aged, because she refused to let painters show her decline. Her speeches thundered with purpose, even when her voice grew hoarse. Her movements were theatrical, deliberate, calculated. Elizabeth ruled not just as monarch, but as stagecraft, a living myth carefully choreographed for survival. But it wasn't just politics or spies that fueled her legend. It was her command of imagery, of symbols, of the human need to believe. She became more than mortal, a nation's muse and mirror. She wore gowns woven with eyes and ears to signify her awareness of all things. She took on the guise of Estrella, the virgin goddess of justice. Her court performed masks where reality blurred with allegory, and no one dared question which was which. Her body was not her own, it was England's. Her words were not merely spoken, they were gospel. And yet, inside, the girl remained, the girl who knew love only in stolen moments, whose very name had once been whispered with disgust, who had watched her own kin plot her death. The price of power was her humanity. She paid it in full. As she aged, her inner circle grew smaller. Dudley died. Walsingham followed. Burleigh, her most trusted advisor, asked with trembling hands and eyes filled with worry for the Queen who no longer listened. She replaced them with younger men, ambitious, flattering, but not loyal in the same bone-deep way. She grew paranoid, restless. She punished those who reminded her of her age, dismissed those who questioned her decisions. She could not let go, not of the crown, not of the myth, not of the fear that if she stopped moving, the world would collapse. And perhaps it would have, for she was not just queen, she was anchor. And even anchors erode. By the final years of her reign, famine had spread through the countryside. The war with Spain dragged on, draining coffers and spirits. The people murmured of weariness, of change, of succession. But no one said it aloud, not while she breathed. No one wanted to see the god bleed. When she finally did, the truth came quickly. The god had been bleeding for years. Underneath the golden robes, her skin bruised with a touch. Her voice cracked with effort. Her memories blurred. She wept in private, spoke to shadows, cursed herself for growing old. Her jewels no longer fit. Her hands trembled when she signed orders, and yet, still, she ruled. Because to stop was to admit it had all been mortal after all. And that was unthinkable. Not just for her, but for the world she had held together by force of will. For 44 years, Elizabeth I had been the sun in England's sky. Her every word, a star in orbit, But even the sun burns out, and when it does, it leaves only darkness. That's what history doesn't show you. It shows the portraits, the speeches, the battles, but it hides the quiet madness of isolation, the terror of dying alone in a palace filled with ghosts, the rage of a woman who gave everything and died with nothing in her arms but the weight of her choices. We celebrate her victories, but we forget the cost. She left no heir, no child to carry her blood, no daughter to inherit her fire, no son to hold the trembling weight of her crown. When Elizabeth I died, it was as if a spell had broken. 44 years of dominance shattered in a single breathless moment. The courtiers, who had once bowed before her every whim, now turned their eyes to James of Scotland, a foreign king for an English throne, a man born of the woman Elizabeth had executed. The irony was a blade twisted into history's side. Mary, Queen of Scots, condemned as a threat, now vindicated through her son's ascension. Elizabeth's refusal to marry, to bear children, had preserved her power, but in the end it erased her bloodline. The Tudor dynasty, forged in war and seduction, dissolved not with rebellion but with silence. And what filled the silence was uncertainty. The transition of power was smoother than many feared, but beneath the surface, a fracture had formed. England had been ruled by a queen who embodied myth-wise, terrible, glorious. James was no such figure. His reign would bring union, yes, but also tension, division, and the slow unraveling of Tudor grandeur. And still, Elizabeth lingered, not in body, but in memory. She had become a symbol too immense to bury. Her name echoed through the marble corridors of the Abbey, etched into the minds of those who remembered the Armada, the New World, the glittering court of poets and spies. Yet those memories, golden as they were, masked the darker truths. For behind the Renaissance splendor, her rule had also been one of ruthless control. She imprisoned dissenters, executed threats, both real and imagined, starved Ireland into submission, and let thousands die in silence when harvests failed and plague returned. Her England was not kind. It was victorious. And victory rarely comes without a graveyard. But she knew this. She had never been under any illusion that power was benevolent. She had watched her father destroy wives and kingdoms alike. She had survived the executions of her mother, her stepmothers, her friends. She had walked the edge of ruin and turned it into a throne. She didn't seek affection. She sought permanence. She didn't want to be loved. She wanted to be remembered. And in that, she succeeded beyond measure. But legacy is not truth. It is a choice. And the truth of Elizabeth's legacy lies somewhere in the spaces history dares not linger. In the tower's hidden rooms, where the walls remember screams. In the frost-covered fields of Ireland, where famine followed her soldiers. In the battered ships of the Armada, where fire met wind and turned empires to ashes. It lies in the hearts of women who saw, perhaps for the first time, that a woman could rule without yielding. And in the silence of her chambers, where loneliness wrapped itself around her like a crown of thorns. We call her the Virgin Queen, as if that were her defining mark, as if purity or the lack of a husband somehow explained the enormity of her soul. But Elizabeth was not virgin, nor widow, nor spinster. She was sovereign, alone not because she lacked love, but because she chose the unthinkable path, to wield absolute power as a woman in a world where that power had always belonged to men. But because she went on to wield power as a woman in a world where that power had always belonged to men, and she paid the price. No cradle rocked beside her bed. No hand clasped hers in her final hour. She had friends, yes, lovers, perhaps, but no one to whisper her name without title, no one to remember her not as Gloriana or Majesty, but as simply Elizabeth. In her later years, she had mirrors removed from her palace. She could not bear to see the face staring back, the sagging flesh, The sunken eyes, the ruin of beauty that once launched ships and inspired sonnets. Her body became a battleground she could not win. She wore ever heavier makeup, ever more elaborate wigs, until the image bore no resemblance to the woman beneath. And yet, even then she ruled. She signed orders, delivered speeches, maintained the illusion, not for vanity, but for England. She had become a living relic, a symbol of continuity in a world always threatening to splinter. Her life was a study in contradiction, fierce but fragile, commanding yet hunted, worshipped yet desperately alone. She was a woman who never apologized for her power, yet who understood better than any man the loneliness that came with it. She gave England peace, prestige, and a vision of greatness that would endure long after her bones turned to dust. But she also gave it fear, silence, and secrets sealed behind the walls of Whitehall and Windsor. Her death did not erase her. It magnified her. And so the centuries that followed repainted her story in brighter colors, turning her into a heroine, a saint of statecraft, a goddess of golden age. But gods do not bleed. Elizabeth did. She bled quietly, in isolation, in agony, and in those final days, stripped of her symbols, she became something even more extraordinary than a monarch. She became real. There in the flickering candlelight of Richmond Palace stood not a queen. And that image, more than any coronation or battlefield triumph, is the one we should remember. Because there is not forged in perfection, it's forged in endurance, in the refusal to surrender, in the ability to carry a crown even when your body begs you to set it down. Elizabeth carried it until her spine gave out, until her mind slipped into darkness, until her name passed into legend. And now, centuries later, her footsteps still echo through the palace corridors. Her portrait still gazes down at scholars and tourists, cloaked in velvet, radiant and terrible. But behind those painted eyes, there is pain. Behind the myth, a girl. Behind the crown, a soul that bore the weight of an empire and was never touched without cost. This is the truth beneath the gold. Not a saint, not a goddess, but a woman, human, flawed, and utterly unforgettable.